Fantastic.
So, well,
okay, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah?
Yes, sorry, I started the recording just now. So, welcome again to everyone to our online learning series brought to you by a joint collaboration of UMV with UNHCR. I'm very pleased to have with us Head of Career Planning and Communication in the Career Management section in UNHCR. Rosie has been leading the training on career transition, helping us from preparing for the next step to approaching the job market. And today we're going to look at building effective CVs and how to market ourselves better on social media, for example, on LinkedIn. Without further ado, Rosie.
Thank you. So we are going to be focusing on CV today. Now, I should say from the very beginning, two things. The first is that the principles of building a good CV can be applied to online application systems. So although you might not be asked to upload a full CV, the type of content that you would be filling in online applications is exactly the same. So that would be the first point. And the second point is LinkedIn has two parts. So it has the part where you have a summary, which is what the search system works on. And it also has the part where you describe your actual profile. And that part of the profile is also very similar in terms of the content that you put in there as what you would put in a CV. So the content that I'm going to be talking about can be applied to online applications, and it can also be applied to how to build a good LinkedIn profile. So as Marcia mentioned, this is actually part of a series of webinars. We started with, this is a little bit the whole process around applications. We tend to go for applications directly without going through each of these first very important steps of assessment, exploring the market, then taking decisions as to where you're going to go, setting your job search strategy. There's a tendency when you're looking for a job to go straight for, I need to do my CV, or I need to brush up my motivation letter, or cover letter as they call it in some places. And I think it is very important to emphasize that, and that's why we're doing the webinars in this order, that before you even start looking at the whole idea of building a CV, you have to go through this assessment of yourself. What is it that you really want to say about yourself? Assessment of the market, exploring the market, taking decisions on where you want to go, and only then start looking at your marketing tools. In the end, the way that we sell ourselves in the job market is no different from the way that companies sell products. And they don't just launch a product to the market. They do a lot of research beforehand in order to understand who the audience is, who's going to buy this product. What is it that's going to make them buy the product? What is it that motivates them? And what are the factors that would go into them selecting that product and not selecting the product from the competition? And in job hunting, it's the same thing. So before you go embark on this process of building your CV and writing your motivation letters, I do really encourage you to go through these previous steps. So if you haven't attended the other webinars, look at them, the recordings, so that you see what those steps might be. Because if not, you're sort of basically launching a product into the market without necessarily knowing whether there's a fertile ground for it, and what is it that is going to make you the candidate that is chosen. So the first session is focused on assess, explore, focus. We also had a session on setting your job search strategy. And so the next three sessions are going to be very much focused on your marketing tools. And the first one is of course, today with a CV. The others are, the next one would be on the 30th of May, writing effective motivation letters. And then the final webinar will be on how to prepare effectively for interviews. So I wanted to kick off the session. This is the first time I've done this, but to kick off the session with a poll so that I can get an understanding of where you're at in terms of how much you think you know about how to build a good CV, and also whether you've done this very recently or actually quite a long time ago. So you'll see there's, I think, 5 questions in the poll that I'll take you through. So Marcia will be putting on the chat the poll link, and I've already activated the first question. Just 1 second, and I'll go to where the poll is. So the first question is already activated. As soon as I see sufficient people replying to it, I'll switch to the next question.
So you see the link in the chat box. If it doesn't work directly as a link, please copy and paste into a browser.
So I can see quite a lot of you already have some knowledge on how to build a good CV. That's good. I think one of the reasons why I'm asking this question is that you will see that some of the information that's in this webinar is pretty basic. It is kind of going through things that would be seemingly extremely obvious. But the reason why I do this is that even in my own work, and I've been working with 28-year-old MBA students who have done probably many job searches, etc. I see that they end up committing very, very basic mistakes on the CV. So although some of the information that I'm going to be talking about may seem very simple, the reason why I'm doing that is just to make sure that you are actually building the very best CV that you can. So just a little caveat there that I'll go quickly through those slides. But that some of the information will be quite basic, but I think it is important because often we see mistakes in the way that people write these things. Okay, I'll start going to the second question. So when was the last time that you applied to a position where you had to present a CV? And this will just give me a good understanding of whether this is something that you've had to do very recently, whether it was actually maybe 3 years ago or even longer than that, because I think it's a good idea. Less than 6 months ago, a lot of you. So you're actively looking for a job right now. That's okay. Okay, so yeah, I would say the majority of you are pretty actively looking from what I can see. Yeah, less than 6 months ago. Okay, it's good for me to know. So next question. Now, when you sent these CVs, was it something that you did proactively? You found the opportunity and decided that you were going to apply, or were you approached by a recruiter saying, we've seen your profile, we think it's very interesting, why don't you apply? So I see the majority of you have been proactive in your job search. I mean, this is what typically happens. It would be wonderful if people could find us and ask us to apply. It doesn't happen so often. Actually, now with things like LinkedIn, it's happening a lot more often than before, because people are able to find, now this information is accessible to a lot more people. Before it was limited to just a handful of headhunters that you might have sent your CV to. Now it's out there. Companies and organizations have people specifically identifying candidates, so it's something that happens more frequently. Wonderful. And I think there's one more question. So do you have a LinkedIn profile, just to get a good understanding? So I see very quickly, yes, a lot of you do. In the session on job search strategy, I do talk about this. This is something that is becoming increasingly, even in different job markets, so not just in the Western markets. It's becoming increasingly a medium for organizations to identify people and to hire people. So it's very important, if you are in job hunting mode, that you build a good profile, because as people have seen, you might be actually not only in your own search that you're actively applying for jobs, you actually might also be found based on the profile that you put there. So it's the ones that have said no. By all means, I mean, at the end of the session, I have some tips on how to build your profile, and I would certainly encourage you, if you are in actively job search mode, to put up your profile there. It's also a wonderful networking site. That's what I primarily use it for. It's a fantastic way of connecting people and finding people that can provide you with the advice, information, and even job opportunities. So by all means, I would encourage you to build your profile. And I think that is the end of the, no, there's one more. Oops. Oh, sorry, sorry, just. Okay, so the final question was around your positioning. You know, to what extent you feel that actually what you have up there positions you well for the type of role that you're interested in. And the reason why I'm asking this is that often we build the profile, but we're not actually quite sure. I mean, we're just saying this is who I am, hopefully take me, but it's not necessarily tailored to the type of positions that you're looking to search. And this is very important because what you put, I mean, you select the information that is up there, and all of these things work on the basis of searches. So if you're not putting the right information, you won't be found. So it's important that you're aware of what kind of information you select, both in sending your CV and also in building your profile, to ensure that you're the person that's selected based on that information. Okay, so we'll go back to the presentation. That gives me a good idea of where you're at in terms of how much you know about the CV, whether you have a LinkedIn profile, and what kind of job search mode you're in right now. So I'm going to be dividing this session into 3 parts. The first is to go into the purpose of the CV. This might seem very obvious, but based on a lot of the CVs that I've looked at throughout my years in recruitment, often I have the feeling that people haven't really quite understood what this document is for. So I think it's important to understand what the purpose is and also what role it plays in the whole application process. Then I'll go into the step-by-step of building an effective CV. As I mentioned, for some of you, that this information might feel fairly basic, but based on a lot of the mistakes that I see on people's CVs, that's why I want to at least touch on it. And then finally, I'll go into a few slides on building your LinkedIn profile. So in terms of purpose of the CV, I'm going to throw the question at you. What do you think this document is for? What's its role? And if you could put your comments in the chat, and Marcia will, I guess, summarize the comments.
Please write in the chat what do you think the purpose of a CV is. So one person answers selling yourself, present a summary of the candidate's professional profile, market your skills, market again, to express how much competent I am for the position. This is about you. Present the achievements, showcase ability and skills, presenting a clear image of who you are and what you can do. The CV is also to match the suitability to whatever position you're applying to and showing how you qualify for the specific job. It's a first chance to sell yourself, what you have to offer, and what you can contribute to an organization. It's an important tool to show the link to whatever position you're applying, as well as providing necessary information to the recruiter. So this is more or less some of the key elements that come up with the big tendency in terms of marketing. There is a lot of talk about marketing, marketing yourself, presenting yourself, and clear linkages to skill, knowledge, attitudes, and competencies toward a specific job. This is what has come up from the chat.
Okay, thank you, Marcia. Well, a CV is absolutely all of that, but the primary purpose of this document is to get you the interview, to take you to the next stage. And the reason why I like asking this question right at the very beginning is that it's not about saying everything about your life or everything that you can contribute to an organization. It's actually selecting what is it that they need to hear. and positions that are advertised are kind enough to tell us what they're looking for. And so I like to pose this question right at the very beginning, because if the purpose of the document is to get you to the next stage, any information which is not relevant to that needs to be cut out, so that you can really highlight why yes, rather than get people confused and lost on information that is not relevant to them. So this is the first key message, is that whatever information is put on that document needs to be absolute, and some of you have actually already mentioned that, it has to be absolutely relevant to what the organization is looking for that specific position. So I mean, the CVs, I mean, the part of an application process, we all know that. But it is very much about getting you the interview, not for telling your whole life story. And so it really is very much about relevance. And I love this. I mean, I remember seeing this cartoon and going, oh, this is fantastic. You know, your resume states that you worked for 2 presidents, you won the Nobel Prize and climbed Everest. You know, that's fantastic. But how are you at telemarketing? So whatever document you put up there needs to be very relevant to what the organization is looking for. And you'll see later on, I'll be talking about these 2 CVs, because sometimes you don't know, maybe you have to put a generic profile. So what is it that you build in that generic profile? But suddenly when you're applying to specific positions, and this is why I say that often in recruitment, I've seen that people haven't really understood the purpose of this document, is that there's a lot of information there that is not relevant to me. And that, as a recruiter, means that I get lost. Instead of finding what I'm looking for, I get lost in information that is not relevant to me. So really important, this idea that it has to be absolutely relevant. So the idea that you're going to build one CV is a myth. You will have multiple CVs depending on what organization you're applying to, depending on the roles within that organization that you're applying to, because every role might be asking for something different. So it's really important to keep this in mind, that relevance, and especially when you're looking at a lot of competition, you know, they're looking for excuses to filter people out. So you can't give them that excuse. You have to make sure that whatever is put there is oh, wonderful, this is definitely somebody who's going in the interview pile. So another aspect of CV is understanding really, you know, who's going to be looking at your CV. And there's essentially 2 audiences. The first filter is usually human resources. So they're the ones that are going to be getting the applications, and they're going to be doing this filter that is then going to be presented to the decision maker, who's the manager. And human resources tend to work in a slightly different way to the way that managers or line managers look at a CV. So they're paid for filter. That's essentially, you know, a lot of people apply and they need to basically filter people out in order to give the manager something, a list of candidates that's manageable for him or her. And human resources, because they're paid to do this, tend to be much more conservative in their choices. So they're looking for proven experience. You know, they're not interested in your potential. What they're looking for is, we're looking for people with 4 years experience in supply or in protection or program or whatever it is, or finance, and you know, they're basically looking, do they have the 4 years, yes or no? So they tend to be much more narrow-minded, if you like, much more conservative in the way that they choose candidates. Now, against that, they're also looking in terms of you as, you know, what kind of career can you develop in this organization? You'll see in the next slide that managers tend to look for, you know, can the person get the job done? Yes or no? I don't care about their career in the organization. What I need is somebody who's going to solve my problems. Whereas human resources is very much looking at whether you fit the organizational culture, whether you have the competencies, the core competencies that the organization is looking for, and they're looking for that global fit, because they're not looking at you in terms of, can you just do this job? They're looking at, okay, will this person have a career a long-term career in the organization? Now, I'm going to talk about this competency language later on in the presentation, but human resources tend to view candidates through competencies. You know, do you have these competencies, which are a mixture of skills, attitudes, and behavior? Because they're not only recruiting you in terms of, do you have the technical experience, technical knowledge, experience, but they're also looking at, because they're looking for that global fit with the organization, whether you have these competencies that you're going to be able to develop throughout your career in the organization. And finally, when it comes to the application as a whole, they will look at the whole application. They're much more statistically likely to read the motivation letter and the CV compared to managers that can often be very, very busy, and they think, look, I don't care about motivation letters. I tend to think that most people write fluff in them anyway. What I'm interested in is what has this person done, because that's going to be the basis of my decision. Not always, but generally speaking, statistically at least, this is what we find. And then the other audience that so second phase is going to be the manager, and the way that managers view candidates can be slightly different. You know, they're usually very busy people. They need to decide very quickly. You know, they usually, as I mentioned, they're very focused on what their problems are and whether the person they're hiring is going to solve those problems. So they're just usually looking at a CV in terms of, can this person do the job or not? And they're much more likely to risk, in the sense that, you know, they're much more likely to sacrifice background because they know that you can do the job. And this is where what we spoke about in previous sessions around making sure that people get to know you, so that maybe even on paper you don't exactly have the profile, but since they know that you've got the competencies to get the job done, they're much more likely to risk on that. Human resources don't know you generally, and so therefore they're much less likely to risk. And that's why we say that instead of speaking competency, they're speaking character. You know, I'm looking for somebody who's a self-starter, who has who's kind of motivated, somebody who has initiative, who's a problem solver. They tend to speak much more in those terms than in terms of, do you have the managerial competencies, yes or no? And as I mentioned, because they're busy, they not always, because we have some managers that are very thorough and will read the motivation letter as well, but they tend to, because they're busy people, focus much more on the CV than they do on the motivation letter. Now, I think it's really important in the whole process of job hunting, what I call applicant IQ, EQ, so applicant emotional intelligence, to try and get an understanding of what these people are receiving on a massive scale. And why is that important? Because when it comes to standing out from the crowd, you need to understand the sheer volume of information that's being thrown at these both of these two audiences. And I put these up not to depress you at all, but just to give you an understanding that actually there's a lot of people applying for jobs, and a very small percentage of those get to the interview. So in that sense, my guru in all of this, I always repeat it, but Daniel Perot always says, you know, a CV is a tool, it's not a job search strategy. So inevitably, in all your applications, you have to submit a CV. Organizations will always ask for it because they need to know, do you have the academic background? Do you have the experience that I'm looking for, etc. But that said, when human resources are receiving these applicants, they're having to go through a huge amount of applications. And in that sense, you cannot afford to do this badly because they're looking for excuses to filter people out. So the more you can tailor it to what that specific position is looking for, to what the competencies of that organization is looking for, the more likely you are going to be the candidate that is actually part of the pool, or is the one that's selected for the interview, etc. Because the numbers of people applying nowadays is extraordinary. You know, in the past, I remember talking to the recruiter from Google, that I think that year, it was 3 years ago, they got 1 million applications worldwide. And she said, you know, in the past, Google in Europe is based in Ireland. And she said, you know, in the past, we would put up a newspaper advert in the Irish Times, maybe you got 50 applicants. Now, you know, where Google, people go on our career site, and you know, you're going to get somebody applying from Brazil, from Indonesia, from Nigeria. You know, everybody has access to this information, and everybody's applying. So the number of applicants per position has risen enormously. And again, it's not to depress you, it's much more to give you an understanding that it's really important, that actually it's not that difficult to stand out. You know, doing a good CV is a way of standing out in that process of a massive of people that are submitting automatic applications without putting too much thought into it.
Rosie, on actually slightly on the same topic, there was one question from Alexandra in Latin America, and she's saying how much the process that you're describing and the realities you're describing are true globally, or do they differ depending on the regions? So would they differ from a European context to a Latin American context to a West African context, for example, to the Asia Pacific context? If you can briefly touch on that.
Okay, I mean, what I've seen is that it's a worldwide phenomenon, but it depends on the maturity of the market. What do I mean by that? For example, Latin America, the Brazilian market, the Mexican market, the market in Colombia. What I've seen in Argentina is another place is sophisticated in terms of people having a lot of having very good online profiles, making online applications. So in certain markets, the activity in terms of volume of applications, etc., is no different from what it would be in Western Europe, in the US. In Asia, for example, the market in Thailand, the market in China is extremely sophisticated as well. If I went to Africa, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, again, are all markets that work, Ghana, that they work, I wouldn't say so differently in terms of the sophistication, if you like, of the way that people are doing applications, no different from what they would be in Western Europe. Now, what happens in the other markets is that for certain companies, because they're multinationals, etc., the volume of, I mean, these companies work the same there as they would work anywhere in the world. So they work at that level. It's just that it's not a general thing in the whole job market. So it is something that is a worldwide phenomenon. India is another place which is I was in Pakistan in September. There are markets that are becoming more and more sophisticated. Now, what is true is that the organizations that have a big name actually represent a tiny percentage of the job market as a whole. And yet, these are the organizations that we tend to gravitate towards. So either UN, so for example, UN, multilateral organizations, big multinationals. So those function the same pretty much everywhere, but how the market is, for all the other companies, for example, India is full of hundreds of very small companies that might be family owned, and so in those cases, well, you probably join those companies through a connection, and B, if they did have a system where you still apply through the local newspapers. It's not so everything that is online, etc. No? I hope that answers your question. So what should a CV include? Well, we all know that, and people have already said it in terms of the purpose of a CV. That needs to express what you've done. So that's fairly clear. So for example, this person worked 4 years as an associate registration officer. This is a very unique CR role, but it also needs to express to a certain extent. The motivation letter gives much more space for this. But how did you do it? So for example, I researched and identified a new tool for registration. So it's not just what you did, but how did you do it? And ideally, it's actually what impact should that have. So it's very much a document that expresses achievements. And so it has to be results based as well. So reduced backlog, increased productivity, reduced cost, etc. So always keep these 3 elements in mind when it comes to building the content of the CV. That it's not just about saying I worked 4 years in supply, but it's actually also what did I do within that. So I created a new tool for following logistics. That you actually also have to talk about the how, and above all, thanks to that tool, I reduced stock taking by blah blah blah, or whatever it is. No, so always keep these three elements in mind. And what's really important and I've talked to so many recruiters about this in terms of what is it that they need to see, what is it that makes you select, one candidate over another, and all of them have systematically said, look, you're receiving hundreds of these. I remember Novartis, the pharmaceutical company, she was getting 450 CVs a week. So she said, for me, there's one very first impression that helps me decide whether I'm actually going to bother to read this document or not. So the first impression is it something that's going to be easy for me to read? Is it well laid out? Do I have things, the conservative formatting, people are putting lots of colors and whatever, they get impatient with it because it's distracting me. I just need to go quickly through this information. Are the sections of the CV well laid out, so it's easy for me to find the information that I'm looking for? Microsoft, which is another organization I used to deal with, language was very important to them because they were recruiting salespeople for very specific markets. And if you didn't have the language for it, that was it. It was a candidate that would be put aside for maybe another market. But if you can't find the languages anywhere on the CV, they get, impatient. And again, they've got lots of people to look through. So, they would basically put that one aside. So it's whether the sections are very clear, laid out, and then also they're looking for some kind of level of coherence. So if the date format is very confusing, if it's not in the right order, if there are gaps that can't be explained, these type of things are also something that very quickly they would say, well, wait a minute, I don't quite understand this. They graduated in 2006 and they only started working in 2010. What's happened in those 4 years? I don't see any experience there, things like that. So this is a very quick, first impression. And then the second impression is when they dive deeper. Now, there's been a lot of research around how many minutes or even seconds recruiters spend doing this. I have to say that they get very good at scanning. For all the love and work that you put into building your CV, this first impression can be less than 10 seconds. Literally, they look at it really quickly, and there's a kind of decision there already whether they're going to go deeper into the second impression or not. But what they've all systematically told me is that the first thing that they look for is relevance. For example, Danielle, the recruiter from Novartis, she told me, look, well, the first thing I do is to basically look down the CV. I'm looking for the action verbs, and the first thing that I'm looking for is, are the action verbs relevant to the competencies or the role that I'm looking for? So if the role required doing analysis, if the role required doing identifying markets, I'm looking for those words, analyzed, identified, etc. And if I see sufficient of those words that ring true to what I'm looking for, then I'll really start reading the rest of the bullet point. So relevance, super important. Generic language, human resource people generally have a degree in psychology, and then maybe a degree in human resource as well. So even in organizations which are extremely technical, which could be a Google, it could be Amazon or Microsoft, they're looking for language when they're reading CVs. They're not looking for something super, all the programming language, that a technical person might be interested in, but human resources are looking to hire people. They're not necessarily only looking to hire the technicalities. So they are looking for CVs which tend to have a generic language. And this is important, especially for career changes, because if you're changing sectors, and the UN, for example, has a habit of using a lot of acronyms, and these are things that are very familiar to us, but nobody outside would understand what those acronyms mean. So, for example, here at UNHCR, we have the whole issue of cash-based intervention. In the outside world, I'm in human resources, and I would think it's competency-based interviewing. So it's really important to keep your CV neutral of all that kind of technicality. Because if you make it too technical, an average human resource person might not understand what you're talking about. What else are they looking for? Career progression. Often people tend to clump together a whole, for example, you've worked in an organization for 6 years, and maybe you've done different roles in that organization, but because you feel that you've got a shortage of space, you put it all as under one experience. and actually you're missing a huge opportunity there. Because if you started as a trainee and then you were put on a certain position and then in another, you're performing and therefore you're being given that extra responsibility. So it's really important to make sure that you actually reflect that on a CV, because career progression doesn't happen unless you perform. So it's a very clear indication to a recruiter that you are delivering. Achievements, this is, we'll go into them later on in the presentation. But in the end, you might have hundreds of engineers, but very few people that have achieved the things that you have done. So it's really important that you don't only focus on, okay, what have you done, but actually, what impact did that have? What did you contribute to the organization? So your bullet points, and we'll go into that in the achievement tutorial, is very much about not only, in your achievements, you're already talking about what you did, but it's very important to focus it as achievements. Action verbs, again, when we go into the nitty-gritty, I'll talk about those, but all sentences should start with an action verb. And then, yes, as I mentioned earlier, not just what, but how did you do it? What skills did you use? Because organizations are not only looking for experience, but they're looking for certain skills as well. So you need to make sure that you're showing how you did these things, what skills did you use, and above all, to express a variety of skills. And this is important, especially in roles where you might be, for example, project management. You might be managing one project after another, and so you have this tendency to, for the sake of argument, say managed X project, managed X project, manage X project, but you're actually missing the opportunity of saying, okay, what are the variety of skills that I used in managing that project? Maybe for one, you can talk about relationship development. For another one, you can talk about results, orientation to results. For another one, you can talk about decision making. So it's really important to leverage the space that you have available to express a variety of skills. Now, as a final comment around this, I know it's a lot of text here, but your CV is your packaging. It's not only the content, so you're basically selling a product, but it's how you format these things and how you lay them out and what type of information you put there is very much part of what image you're conveying. And I know this sounds really obvious, but often people completely, maybe the content is great and then it's full of spelling mistakes. What does that say about you? If in something so important as a job application, it's full of spelling and grammatical errors, what does that say about your work? Maybe your work also implies doing presentations to local authority or to a senior management or to a client, and what does that say about you? And I can guarantee you, especially in the private sector, a lot of CVs are filtered out on just that very detail. Because they think actually if your application has errors, why would the work that you do be any different? So really important that it's not only a matter of focusing on the content, but also formatting on how you lay out this information and the style in which you communicate it. It's also extremely important.
Rosie, we have two interesting questions that came in.
Yeah.
One is on the relevance, on the element of relevance. And when writing, for example, a PHP or a P11, so in a UN context, would it be more appropriate to omit information that could be considered irrelevant or experience that could be considered irrelevant to the position? Or would it be better to just leave the full CV knowing that it's a P11 so that, eventually will be reused maybe internally in the organization or not? And that's one question. And then I have a different one.
Okay, in terms of, you'll see later on I'm going to talk about these two phases in terms of applications. I think if you're building a profile, you need to put everything there because you don't know at that point what it is that they're looking for. And often if you're building a profile, you don't know what you're going to be searched for. So I think in when it comes to building a P11, I would put everything there. Because in the same way that you might then use that application for one specific profile, and then you have an opportunity to put in the motivation letter, okay, out of all of this, this is what's most relevant to you. they might be searching for somebody with your, other elements of your experience that they might find interesting, and then you would be missing out on an opportunity. Now, so I do think actually there's some fundamental, because there's also going to be a gap, and they're going to think, oh, wait a minute, what did you do between 2008 and 2010? I don't see that information there. Now, when it comes to submitting job applications, then you can minimize that information because it's irrelevant. So don't take it out altogether, but maybe you just use one line, because what you really want to emphasize is the relevance of your other experience. And so if you want to make things, in the end, job applications are about highlighting how you fit. So you can use how much emphasis you give on the information that is most relevant and how much information is given on the little relevance. Now, that said, in the work that I've done with clients, I have seen, for example, that maybe they spent just 1 year in an organization, for example, in the humanitarian sector, then they decided to leave that, went to the private sector, worked on something completely different for 4 years, and now they're applying again to the humanitarian sector, and then that year becomes, is given the same amount of space as the 4 years that you worked in the private sector. No? I mean, that is less kind of advisable, because you do need to dedicate the proportion of space in your CV to the amount of time that you spent in these organizations. So if you can't make it relevant in terms of sector, well, make it very relevant in terms of the role, for example. So you can still choose, bullet points which are very relevant to the role that you're applying to. But in terms of the amount of space, it just looks strange. If you spend 1 year in one place and you give it 6 lines, and then you spend 4 years in another, you're only giving it 2 lines. It looks very strange to a recruiter. So I hope that answers your question. So that would be the first thing on relevance. When I talk about these 2 phases, I think hopefully that will become a bit clearer, because it's very similar to what you might do on a LinkedIn profile. Your profile is public, and anybody from different sectors might be looking at it. So to what extent do you tailor that information to what you're looking for versus having something which is very generic, which might be attractive to a lot more organizations? But we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation.
The second question then, thank you so much, Rosie. The second question then, perhaps you will touch upon also later on, because it's more linked on how we build the effective CV, but I'll put it right there, so perhaps it links nicely in the next session, which is from Natalia. What would be more of a priority, chronology, so making sure that the recruiter sees I've been busy, or the type of jobs, so the type of position I have? What is more relevant or more important to highlight?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say in terms of how we work as human beings, chronology is extremely important, because it just gives some sort of storyline. You graduated from university, you started here, then you went there, then you did this, and you did that. So I would always maintain chronology. I think it's very confusing to a recruiter if things are changed around, because this is what's most relevant to you, so this is what I'm going to talk about first, and this is what I'll talk about later. So I would always keep the chronology. Now, that said, as I mentioned earlier, what you emphasize within that chronology is your choice. So if there are some things that are, and you also have in mind that you're not only presenting this document, you're also presenting the motivation letter. And the motivation letter is a fantastic opportunity to be able to say, okay, out of that chronology, this is what's most relevant to you. And this is the reason why I'm a great candidate for this position. So you have, it's not a document that necessarily works on its own. You've got the 2 things. But as I say, as human beings, if you think about it in your own, if somebody's just telling you their story and they're saying, you start with university and then you go back to where you were born and where you went to school, and now I'm going to jump to my second experience and I'll give you my first one, they find it much more difficult to digest the information. So I would always keep the chronology.
I think that brings us nicely into the next section, because there are more questions on how the CV is built. So Josephine asked, what is the maximum length of a CV? Would the Europass template, which is quite extensive, what is just put, is it a good idea to just put the job description of the position you occupied in the CV? And a follow-up on the previous question, which is actually linked to how CVs are built differently or are presented differently according to region, so it depends culturally. So Alex was saying that in Latin America she has seen CVs of 15 pages, for example, which would be completely unacceptable in Europe. So also how much the cultural issue linked to the CV.
Okay, yeah. Now we'll be touching on each of these things. I mean, I guess just to summarize this part of the presentation, I think we talked about relevance, and I think they always do talk about this job hunting process a little bit like kind of dating. If you're boring somebody with information that is not relevant to them, very quickly they're going to lose interest. So this is very much about telling them what they need to hear. So it's not necessarily talking, I mean, you decide what lens you're going to be putting on all the type of things that you could talk about. What is it in terms of choosing the information? And again, this has to do with length. You want them to home in on what's really important to them. And so in that sense, just understand what these organizations are looking for and select information based on that. So in terms of the step-by-step, so I talked about these two stage process. So there's one first phase, which can be for putting up a profile in different organizations. You don't know at that point exactly what it is that they're looking for your LinkedIn profile, etc. Or maybe you're sending your CV to agencies, or you're putting up on sites where, again, you don't really know who's looking at that, but it can be a very wide range of employers from different sectors and wide range of hiring needs. So there is one phase in which you need to understand what would a general CV look like, what do most organizations look for, so that whatever it is that they're looking for, I'm going to have at least part of that. And so that would be one first phase. And then the other one, of course, is when you're applying to specific roles. And again, statistically, 95% of applicants don't actually tailor their CVs. They build a certain profile and they say, okay, that's it. It's quite a lot of work to do. So they tend to put up exactly the same profile regardless of what it is that they're applying to. And again, if you think about the number of applicants, they're looking for excuses to filter you out. Between a candidate that fits 80% and a candidate that fits 90%, they're going to choose a candidate with 90%. And maybe you had that extra 10%. But you haven't put it there, so that's why you're not the chosen candidate. So I do think we need to look at this process in terms of, okay, I'm going to build something very generic first, and then, okay, when I'm looking to apply to specific positions, let's really look at what they're looking for and make sure that I actually tailor everything that is put there to that specific job requirement. And somebody talked about this earlier, but it is very much a process of matching. As I mentioned, the organizations are kind enough to tell you, what is it that they're looking for. They're looking for maybe a certain type of university degree, the functional experience, sector experience, maybe even geographical experience. Some organizations are very clear on what competencies they're looking for or what kind of languages they're looking for. So that's the organization, and then of course there's you. So you have certain background, you have a certain degree, you have a certain, your grades, your functional experience, etc. And so all you're doing in this process is saying, okay, what is most relevant? That's how I'm going to select specifically what goes in that CV. Somebody asked earlier about the length of a CV. So these are the sections in terms of, it depends very much how much experience you have. So generally, if up to 6 years experience, you could fit your CV on one page. Again, this is about talking about what's relevant to them, not your whole life story. So it's very much about selecting the information. Long CVs people feel lost in all that information. Our internal system at UNHCR, somebody with maybe 17 years experience might have a CV, we call it a fact sheet, which is something like, well, now I think we've got a shortened version and it might be 17 pages long. And that's absolutely absurd. I mean, no manager maybe they get between 15 and 20 applicants. no manager is going to be looking at 17 pages for 15 and 20 people, because I mean they've got other things to do. For a start, we're an organization that has a very clear mandate. So it's length is not necessarily good at all. And I'll talk a little bit more about the length a bit later. So up to 6 years experience, it's pretty normal to have a one-page CV. Now, how you order that information is, generally speaking, personal information. At that point, education is still very important because you haven't got sufficient work experience to be evaluated. And then you have a fourth section, which is on general information. So this would be typically how people with less at the start of their careers would organize their CV. People between 7 and 15 years experience, two pages is what is recommended. But there the order of the information changes. And when you've got 7 to 15 years experience, the first thing that they're going to be interested in is, okay, what have you been doing? The fact that you might have done a university degree is just a box to tick off, but it's not necessarily going to condition whether you're the person that's going to be hired or not. Because if you have very consolidated work experience, the fact that you don't have a degree in that is irrelevant to a recruiter, and certainly very relevant to a manager. So the order of the information changes. So education goes much lower down, and again, general information at the bottom. When it's 15 years experience all the way up to retirement, what is recommended nowadays is that after personal information, you give them a summary, because that CV is going to be much longer. Ideally, they will say 3 pages max, but if it is going to be even longer, then give them a summary that basically states in a paragraph what your experience has been. That will help the person reading it understand, okay, out of all these pages, what is it that is most important? Then the work experience, then education, then general information. Now, somebody mentioned that they had 15-page CVs. They may exist. For example, I know in the architectural world, people tend to have a list of all the competitions that they've submitted projects to. They have all the projects that they worked on, etc. I still think that the experience part should be 2 pages, and then you have an annex that if somebody wants to look at all those competitions that you submitted to, and all those projects that you worked on, they can also look at that. But the work experience should still be, you're looking for something that helps people decide. And the more information you provide them with, the more difficult it is for them to take a decision. So I know it sounds very counterintuitive, but actually less is more. It's much better to give them an aperitif. And then if you want, submit as an annex that they can voluntarily decide they're going to read or not read, but don't lose the most essential information in a mountain of information because it's going to be less effective for you.
Thank you, Rosie.
Marta, you're going to say something? Yeah.
Yes, I have a few questions. So Pietro is asking about writing a pitch at the top of the CV, like a short summary like you do on LinkedIn. And also there are questions on the 5 years experience. Is this not considered enough? Or is it okay to put a lot of work experience and then some info of education with a 5-year experience CV? So I think what they're trying to ask is that if you have more than 5 years experience and you still have a 1-pager CV, is that okay? With just some short information on education. And the other questions are 2. Do you include references? And do you include published works, for example, articles and publications that you might have?
Okay.
So the first one.
Let me start. Yeah, let me start with the elevator pitch at the top of CVs. This is similar to this idea of having a summary. For people with a lot of experience. Personally, this might be a personal view of mine, but I've seen very few elevator pitches that I've thought I can believe them. I would much rather see proof through your achievements than somebody telling me excellent professional with 6 years experience working in international markets with all these kind of buzzwords. I find them personally very irritating, and a lot of the recruiters that I've spoken to also find them very irritating because they sound very artificial. You know, hardworking, international executive, all this kind of elevator pitch style thing doesn't tell me much about the candidate. I'd much rather see that you're somebody who delivers results. I'd much rather see that in the bullet points in terms of the achievements, that you created this new idea and then delivered it ahead of time. I'd much rather see that as part of the bulk of your CV than seeing it in a summary. I mean, I wanted to leave the summary part for when we go to LinkedIn, because as you mentioned, it is a very important part of LinkedIn. I've seen some very good summaries and then some really like, oh, give me a break. And I'll talk about the most used buzzwords that people tend to use, and they're so overused that, you know, they've lost all effect completely. Now, maybe I have a personal allergy against them, but as I say, I've seen very few summaries that I've thought, okay, this gives me a good or elevator pitch. This gives me a good idea of who this person really is. So my advice would be, if you want to include it, you know, there's no rules around, you know, set rules around CVs. If you want to include it, just make sure that it's something that actually really does describe who you are, that is backed up by proof, rather than you just saying it. You know, great leader of people or whatever people tend to put up there. It's, you know, how do I know? You know, no, you're saying it, but how do I know? So if you do it, you know, back it up with specific example, something that will show me that you actually do have that, because if not, it's just you saying it. So that would be on the elevator pitch. In terms of references, I would not put references unless they're asked for. I mean, some people do put right at the bottom of the CVs, you know, references available on a request, and I think that's good enough. But I mean, I would not, again, why give information when they haven't actually necessarily asked for it? And certainly in the application process, and certainly within the UN system, they will ask for those references. So, you know, you already have to put it there in the application itself. But I wouldn't necessarily put the references unless it's already been, you know, please provide the references in as part of the application process. Now, in terms of published works, I'll talk about that because that goes very much in general information. It depends very much on what sector you're applying to and whether those published works are relevant to what you're applying to. I worked a lot in the academic world, and so publications were extremely important. I mean, I have them on my profile because it is a validation of what have you done. Depending on the sector that you're applying to, it is important. But above all, if whatever it is that you published is relevant to what you're applying to, even more important. If it's something that you might have done as part of your studies at university, but is not relevant to what you're applying to, again, you have a limited space. If you have the space, you might feel you want to put it up there, but if you don't, I wouldn't. I mean, again, it's not relevant. So, in the same way that you might not say that you're a sailing champion, well, you know, or maybe actually that might be interesting to put in general information. You know, other things that you might want to talk about that is not relevant to the position, then, you know, I would take them out.
Then just a follow-up question.
Yeah.
On the general information, what kind of information goes under general information? Publication is one of them. What else?
Well, there are things like, I mean, I'll go into it because there's a slide on this, but things like your hobbies, you know, maybe you did some volunteer work or internships that you might not want to occupy the same amount of space in your work experience, but actually the internships that you worked on were actually relevant to the position that you're applying to. But I'll go into what else can go in general information in a minute.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so the very basics. I know for some of you that, you know, scored highly on your knowledge of CVs, this might feel a little bit basic. But in terms of your name, it doesn't necessarily need to be exactly as your passport. It can be as you're known. But what's really important is that whatever names you use the same name throughout the application process. Because if not, it's very confusing when they're trying to match the CV that they've downloaded to the profile that you filled in the online system. To whatever it is that you signed off in your motivation letter. If there's a divergence there, it becomes very confusing for recruiters. So it doesn't, I mean, my name is Roseanne, but I always use Rosie, so I use Rosie throughout, but at least it's the same thing in the application, in my letter, in my CV, so that I know that there's no incoherence between the things, although officially my name is Roseanne. So this is one aspect. In terms of personal information, this is where the cultural differences vary. So it's very important to understand, I mean, often it's determined by, if it's an application process online, it's determined about what they're asking there. So, you know, you don't have to worry about it. But where I've seen some very, very fundamental differences is in the type of information that is put in, depending on what country you're from. And this is especially when it comes to personal information. So the Anglo-Saxon world, so we're talking US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, even India actually, they tend to neutralize a lot of personal information. It's not acceptable. So things like your marital status, photograph, age, gender, even, you know, the idea behind this is that you should be looked at purely as a professional being, and that none of these things should create any biases against you being the right candidate. Now, LinkedIn, very interestingly, was created by an American, it's an American company, and photograph is absolutely essential to the profile. So they've really broken this thing, this idea that photographs shouldn't be part of a CV. I worked a lot in the Spanish-speaking world, and photograph is totally standard, and certainly putting all your personal information is totally standard as well. My recommendation would always be to ask locally what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Now, the multinationals that I worked with all accepted, I mean, for example, in the UK, in theory, by law, you're not allowed to accept applications that have these type of personal information in, because at some point they fear that they're going to be liable, be made liable for discrimination because the candidate hasn't been selected. And then they can say, oh, you know, you were biased against gender, or I'm too good looking, or I'm too old, or I'm too young, etc. And so, in theory, because of that, there's, you know, by law, they're not meant to accept applications with all this information. Now, if you're a multinational and you're accepting applications from Latin America, from Spain, from Germany, from Asia, etc., you have to accept that they don't necessarily know, the candidates don't necessarily know these rules, and you're not going to say no to a candidate because you're, you know, you have this rule. So they tend to be a little bit flexible on that, but you just need to be aware of these, you know, kind of norms. Germany, for example, is an interesting country. I mean, you put everything on your CV, absolutely. And one would think, okay, it's a northern country. Maybe they would have followed more this kind of Protestant, you know, way of viewing candidates. But actually, very standard to have excellent. Germans always have very good photographs on their CVs, you know, all your marital status, your age and gender, etc. So what I would recommend is always inquire, okay, what is the norm in this country that I'm applying to, and then do a CV in accordance with those rules, because there are actually some very fundamental differences. For example, in Spain now, well, in Europe now, as a norm, you no longer put nationality. You have to put work permit, because it's something which is either you're legally entitled to work there or you're not. But nationality is also seen as a reason for discrimination. So in the past, it was very normal for people to say that they were Spanish, or that they were from Morocco, or from whatever. Now, in Spain, you know, they've decided this is not. I mean, it could be for discrimination. So actually, just tell me, do you have a work permit to work here? Yes or no? That's what I'm interested in. In terms of address, no longer necessary, physical address. In the past, it was very standard for you to put your home address, and you know, some judgments were made on the basis of where your house was or not was. Nowadays, because everything is online, what is really important is that you put contact details. So it has to be an email address and a contact number. And this may sound really, really obvious, but I've been told by at least 6 recruiters from different organizations that it's sometimes incredibly frustrating to find a really good candidate, and then they want to contact them, and for some reason they've forgotten to put their contact details there, so you know, they can't contact them. So so that's the level of information you should have on that side. And again, nationality, it depends on the country, but pay attention to that, because I think what's most important for an organization is, do you have a work permit that entitles you to work there, yes or no? And that is something which is objective, it's legal, and it's not a reason for discrimination. So very general principles. Again, this is very, very basic stuff, but dates should always be in reverse order. So you start from what you did last, and then you work backwards to what you did first. And the reason for that is very simple. You know, whatever you did last is a culmination of everything you did beforehand. So as you build your skills, you know, as you get more experience, you increase the responsibility, you gain more skills, etc. So that's what recruiters are most interested in. So although we talked about chronology in the past, it is important to maintain that chronology, but in reverse order. So they can actually, sometimes recruiters even start at the bottom and they say, okay, you know, they graduated from university, I can see that in their education, and okay, first they did this and they did that, and they work up the page. But ultimately, you're going to be hired on what you did last. That's the most important, or generally, you're going to be hired on what you did last. That's the most important thing, because generally, that's where you've really built the experience. That's where you've really built the skills that they're looking for. Now, whatever date format you use, and it can be, you know, month, year. Sometimes people even put seasons, so autumn to spring, you know, with a year. Whatever it is that you use, just use the same format throughout the CV. So don't use one for one work experience and another one for another work experience, because it becomes very confusing for the recruiter. I tend to like, you know, really clean date formats. So even if you might have started in December 2009, I still prefer 2009 to 2012 because it's just cleaner. But some recruiters really do actually like to know, okay, what month did you start? So it was December, not January, and that gives you one more year now. Experience, as I talked about earlier, in proportion to the amount of time spent there, and there again, talking about the number of pages that is recommended. And I know there's always a temptation, I want to make it longer, but this has to serve as an aperitif. Again, it's not talking about your whole life story, it's just telling them what they need to hear. And then if you need to elaborate that in an interview, but this has to serve like an appetizer. I want to meet this person, so you need to keep it short. So education, now really important, especially when we're working in a multinational setting. You know, state the official university name, check the name in the UNESCO list of universities. Why do I say that? Because when people start translating, often you might actually even get the university confused, because it may be the state university and then also the private university, and they both have very similar names. So really important, just keep it as it is. They're going to be asking for transcripts, so they can already see, again, it needs to be the same as whatever it is that you submit. So keep things exactly as, you know, the official name is. All organizations have, they can go to UNESCO. There's another list that they also go to in order to identify different universities. So it helps them to know what the official name is. Same with a degree. Keep to the official degree that you have. Don't try and make the equivalent in the US system or the equivalent in the you know, whatever other system, because again, they're going to be asking for transcripts, and any divergence, they're going to think, hey, wait a minute, you know, here it says diploma and you're telling me this is a degree. So just put whatever is officially in your in the piece of paper that they gave you. And again, a lot of online systems already have this integrated. So what kind of degree is it? You have to choose out of a drop-down list. So try to make it as you know, as equal, because they're going to be asking for transcripts, and we have had situations in which people said that they had a master's and actually wasn't a master's at all. And that creates a big problem in the recruitment process, to the point that they might even withdraw an offer. The grades, same thing, state the original grades. All large organizations have ways in which they can convert that to the American equivalent, or the UK equivalent, or the European equivalent, etc. And then, I know it's a very American thing, but if you didn't have awards as part of your university degree, such as, you know, in the UK system it's class medals, in the US it's Dean's List, in some other systems it might be something else. This is especially important for people with few years experience, because again, you don't have that much work experience, so you're still going to be judged very much on what you did academically. So you can put your degree and then put what your special awards or mentions might be there. Now, if there's no room there, a lot of people also put them in general information. So that PhD award, not PhD, thesis for a bachelor's degree, or awarded, or dissertation awarded, blah blah blah. So the work experience, this is actually the most important part of the CV. I know I've spent quite a lot of time on all the other things, but this is the core of what a CV. That's what they're going to be hiring you on the basis of this. Now, what's super important is to have a 2-line description of what organization you're working for, because you might know that organization very well, but not even within the UN system. There's confusion about different agencies. So it's important to actually describe specifically what that agency did. And the same with your role. People, job titles mean very different things in different organizations. So just having a 2-line description of what your role was, what the scope of work is also incredibly useful for recruiters. Again, I know I'm referring to Novartis as an example, but the role of marketing in Novartis was very, very close to, the role of sales in Novartis was very close to marketing. So although it might have said sales director, when you actually look at what the role was, it was actually much closer to marketing. And the reason why they did that was just kind of distance, people selling medication from, there's a lot of corruption around doctors being paid, trips to the Caribbean in exchange for them taking on your medicine. So to distance that, they actually changed the role, although the title was exactly the same. So, as a recruiter, you might not know that until you see sales, and actually the role is much more marketing based. So it's really important to put that kind of description. And then after that, start listing your achievements, and I talk about TORs. So what kind of things can you say about the organization? Well, some organizations are incredibly well known, so maybe you don't need to say anything at all. And if it is a household name, you can skip this part. But as I mentioned, a lot of organizations, even when they're well known, might get confused by other organizations simply because people don't know enough about them. So what kind of things can you talk about? Well, what activity? So it provides consulting services, or it's a humanitarian organization. Where does it operate? And why do I want to know that as a recruiter? Because, is this a 2-man show, or is it something that is really operating in a lot of different continents and countries? It's already giving me an understanding of how big that operation is. What kind of turnover does it have, or budget does it have? Again, it gives me as a recruiter an indication, is this a large organization or a small organization? And then the number of employees, the same thing. And why is that important? Because there are some huge organizations that are not household names. I remember I worked with a lot of Russian clients, and there's some huge companies in Russia that I'd never heard of, although literally when you look at the turnover and the number of employees, maybe they were employing 15,000 people, but it wasn't something that I was very familiar with. So I think it is important to give a description of the organization. And in terms of function, what are we talking about? Main responsibility, whether you have responsibility of a budget. If you have it, if you don't mention it. Who you report it to. Again, I'm trying to get an understanding as a recruiter where in the hierarchy you are, and whether this was a leadership role or not, whether you had people reporting to you or not. So let me give you an example. So this, again, it's a very UNHCR example, but this is somebody who worked as an associate registration officer. So this would mean a P2 person. So, I mean, it's just 2 lines. So part of a team of 10 conducting the registration of mainly Afghan and Myanmar nationals seeking protection in India, reporting to the protection officer. So it gives me, as a recruiter, a very, very quick indication of what this person has done. This is the description of the organization. So UNHCR is a UN program mandated to protect and support refugees, internally displaced and stateless people. In Liberia, the UNHCR addresses the needs of over 40,000 people of concern through 4 offices, just over 100 staff members, and a budget of approximately 34 million. So, very quickly, I understand what organization they're working for, and they're working in Liberia in this case, because the gap in between is Liberia, and it very quickly it gives me an understanding of what the size of that operation is. Is it a huge operation? Is it a small operation? And I can see that it's sizable enough. No? And again, you've got the bit in between, which is from being an associate registration officer, they became a P3 protection officer in Liberia. And what are they doing there? Responsible for coordinating protection activities throughout the second PA region, including strengthening government capacity, RSD, and supporting the development of Liberia's asylum system. So it doesn't have to be very long, but from a recruiter perspective, as I say, it gives you a very clear indication of the size of the organization and the responsibility of the person that's sending that CV to me.
Lucy, before we move on to how to build the CV specifically, there are some more generic questions on the part that we already looked at. In particular, some are referring to, for example, the details and personal information that is disclosed. So photographs, marital status, age, and gender. And some were pointing out what about positive discrimination when they ask for a specific gender, for example, or a specific nationality. But perhaps it doesn't happen in those countries. But I don't know, I'm just going to put it there because I thought it was interesting. Then some people are convinced that 6 years in one page CV is absolutely impossible. So any tips on that? Another question is on degrees not being available on the UNESCO list, and then what do we do then? And the last question on who is screening who's first screening the CVs. Are there organizations using, for example, software working with keywords, or is it always a human behind the computer?
Okay, just let me write those down so I don't forget them. And who? Okay. I mean, in terms of positive discrimination, I mean, undoubtedly it does exist, and for a very clear reason. I'm talking about the UN system now. There's a very clear desire on the part of the UN that there should be gender parity. So while it doesn't mean necessarily that men are being filtered out, it does mean, for example, that UNHCR, that if we can, and it's impossible in certain job functions, what we're trying to do to redress this gender imbalance in certain functions is that you have a certain number of applicants, they're all equally good. 3/4 of the candidates that are sent to the manager are female staff members, and 1/4 are male staff members. And we're doing that because we have a very clear need to redress their balance. In some job functions, we have 80 or 90% male staff members and only 10 or 20% female staff members. And clearly, if we're going to be able to move towards this gender parity, we need to do something about it. So, and the same thing happens for. And again, this is a matter of the regional distribution within UNHCR is not equal in all job functions. And in some cases, this works against us because at the moment, for example, we don't have sufficient Arabic speakers in quite a lot of functional areas, for example, supply. And clearly our operations in the Middle East are Arabic speaking and extremely important at the moment, and we don't have sufficient staff for that language. So it makes sense, even if the candidates are fantastic that are applying, to positively discriminate in favor of the ones that actually have the languages that we're looking for. So we may need program officers or protection officers generally, but if we can already redress that balance and make sure that we have, people with the right languages that will enable us as an organization to be able to send people to a lot more different places, then this is something that we're gonna have to do, because it's a responsibility to make sure that all regions are well represented and all genders are represented. So that's what I would say in terms of positive discrimination. Now, in terms of how this is reflected in the application system, I mean, you will see in a lot of applications, we're an equal opportunities employer, but you will also see in some job positions where they're saying, women are especially encouraged to apply. We're especially interested in women, no? So it's not that we're gonna, they're men, we don't want men to apply at all. It's just that in this selection process, in trying to redress that balance, if women have the good profile, they will, be presented to managers in a greater proportion than men will. So that's on I guess, the positive discrimination side. In the application system, well, things like photograph, this is only if you're sending a CV yourself, that it's a piece of paper that you're going to be attaching to an email or uploading to a system. And it's interesting, they've done a lot of studies. Being good looking as a woman works against you, whereas being good looking as a man is in your favor. I mean, there's these kind of biases which a lot of organizations are becoming much more conscious of, and they're trying to redress. So, because why should a good-looking guy be any more better than not so good-looking guy, and why should a good-looking woman be worse than a non-good-looking woman? So large organizations especially are becoming more and more conscious of this. I mean, we even have a person that's training us on every person at DHRM on all these unconscious biases, they call them. But you choose what information you provide. So you need to decide whether this is something you want to include or not. I mean, in terms of following the cultural norm, I think it's better. I mean, if people are used to seeing some information and then it's not there, they'll think there's something wrong here. And vice versa, that if there's information that they don't think is relevant and you're including it, they might think, you're not adjusting to what it is that I do. No? So that's what I would say in terms of the positive discrimination, what information you include. I mean, gender and age, for example, are often your name. It's very unlikely that a man's going to be called Rosie. So they would, I mean, maybe it does exist, but generally speaking, they would already, or Roseanne, they would automatically know that it's a female name. So they already know my gender, even if I don't put it in the application. And in terms of my age, most people go to university at a certain time in their life. So you might get it wrong by 1 or 2 years, but you're not going to get it wrong by 10. So they can still discern, how experienced you are, or how, when more or less what age you would be. Now, the idea that 6 years of experience cannot fit on one page, I totally contest that, because I work with MBA students that on average had 6 years experience, and our CVs were regarded at IESE to be the best in the MBA market, and all of them were one page. We didn't allow, I mean, what they submitted to companies on their own was one thing, but our CV system was completely based on a one-page CV. Because again, you are choosing what information you want to highlight. This is not about talking about everything that you've done. So it's very much, if you know how to select information well, I mean, it's like when you go to a fruit shop, you've got this huge pile of apples. You're not choosing every single apple. You're just choosing the 10 most, because you can't eat them all. So you're very much choosing which are the
You disappeared. Your audio is completely gone. I can still see you online, but I don't hear you anymore. Rosie?
Okay.
Talk? Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, you can hear me.
You were
Okay.
on.
In terms. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of universities that are not on the list, I mean, I would say two things. The first is put whatever university you want to, and then, you know, let the organization, I mean, the problem is, but this is the first organization that I've encountered this with. The UNHCR, for example, the new application system, which was kicked off maybe about a year ago, now has a drop-down list with the UNESCO list of universities. Now, it does provide an option for, if it's not here, please write it down here.
Rosie, you're gone again. Rosie? Rosie, try and unmute yourself again, because we can't hear you. Dear colleagues, I don't know what is happening. I think Rosie is having some technical difficulties. Let's give it a little bit of time to see if she can rejoin us.
Hello.
Anis,
Can you hear me?
yes, Anis, we can hear you, but we don't need to hear you. We need to hear Rosie. Are there any questions that are not UNHCR specific that perhaps I can also try and answer? If so, just write them in the box.
No, I just can't hear the screen, main screen.
So at the moment what is happening is that Rosie's gone offline. So that is the problem. I think she must have some technical difficulties. And that's why also the screen is gone, because she was leading the screen.
Okay.
We just need to wait a few minutes, and then I will also monitor my my emails. If she cannot rejoin, then we can probably schedule a follow-up where we're going to look at specifically building the CV and then working on the LinkedIn. But let's
Okay.
wait a couple of minutes, please. So are there any questions just in general on what has been discussed so far? On building your CVs, what is the information that is important on the CV? and how to target it?
Yes, I have some questions about regarding CV.
Yes.
I am a professional and I have computer science degree and specialization in cloud computing. So I went to fill up the P11 form recently for an ICT provincial ICT measure in United Nations. But I can't put very much detailed in there because of shortage of the things like there are no more space to uh, detail about what I can do or what I can or what I have done before.
Okay, so I think, Anis, I think the information here, it is very, very clear what Rosie has said, and she's kind of stressed this point several times. The idea is that you need to build a CV that is relevant for each one of the positions or the applications that you're running. And when you're doing that, you need to identify the specific expertise that is needed. In those cases where the space is limited, then you really need to focus and perhaps work on a one line which can summarize perhaps some of the key achievements and kind of work as a teaser for the person that is going to receive then your CV on the other side. And when you attract their attention, then what the aim of the exercise is that they call you back. So then you can do, you can then kind of expand the information once they call you back. But the idea is that to make the CV concise and really kind of generic in terms of language that you use so that it's clear for everyone, and then kind of target to the specific position that you want.
Okay, thank you. I got you. And one more question I have.
Yes, I have also questions online. You can also use the chat box, Anis, if you want, so that you can type whilst I answer some of the other questions if you want.
Okay, okay.
So I have a question on saying that sometimes you receive training on how to build a CV that contains different kind of information. At the end of the day, the CV is something very kind of personal in the way that you present it. What I think the focus should be on is the relevance that we talked about and of your experience that you present towards the position that that you're applying for. So there are, of course, different ways to apply. There are different ways to build CVs. There are, depending on where you're trying to pursue your career in, then you would have different environments and different requirements as well in terms of CV writing. So, for example, personally, I have 3 different kinds of CV ready all the time. One is, of course, the UN CV, because I might want to apply to UN positions. But one is a generic CV, which is 4 pages long in total. And then I have a Euro Pass CV, which is sometimes required by certain organizations in Europe specifically. So from those, then I build in the different sub-CVs depending on which kind of environment I'm applying to. So if it's the private sector, I will use the generic CV. If it's the public sector in Europe, I would use the Europass CV. If it's the UN, I will use the P11. And this is what you need to do. Normally the information can be different and they can focus on different things depending on what they're trying to pass on as information. But at the end of the day, I think the reality is the lessons learned are 2 points. It has to be relevant and it has to be targeted. So I see that Rosie is not coming online. So if you agree, I apologize. I don't know what's going on. It must be some technical problems on our side. But if you agree, what I will do is I will create a follow-up to this webinar, which will actually perhaps briefly summarize what we discussed so far, and then move on more into building your CV with using specific tools like the situation, action, results, type framework, which was what Rosie was showing us in her example, and then looking at applying to the role and looking at competences. So I hope that's okay. Apologies for the inconvenience. I will schedule that then between this and is the 30th of May is scheduled the next webinar, which is on motivational letters. So I will try to schedule it in maybe 10 days from now at the same time, and you will receive all the information. So thank you for that. What is from today, the recording I will still share on the eCampus, and then I will check in with you after I spoke to Rosie to give you the new date for the rest of the webinar. Thank you so much, and good evening, afternoon, rest of the day.